Welcome to Classified Avenue. If you're interested in real mysteries and true crime cases that remain unexplained, please like this video. It genuinely helps the channel. Now, let's begin. Mystery on the Mountain. The 1993 Khamar Daban incident. The remote Khamar Daban mountain range in Siberia, where a mysterious tragedy unfolded in August 1993. Episode 1. The expedition begins. In the summer of 1993, a seasoned hiking instructor named Lyudmila Korovina led a group of 6 young hikers into the picturesque wilds of the Khamar Daban mountain range in southern Siberia. Khamar Daban, spanning Buryatia near the shores of Lake Baikal, was a well-known trekking destination for adventure enthusiasts. Korovina's group hailed from the city of Petropavlovsk, Petropavl, in northern Kazakhstan, where they were members of the Azimut Tourism Club. This was not a casual outing, but an organized expedition steeped in the culture of Soviet-era sports tourism. To understand this journey, one must appreciate the robust hiking culture from which it arose. During the Soviet era, outdoor sports tourism was highly organized. By 1975, there were over 100,000 certified sports hikers across the USSR, including more than 600 who earned the title Master of Sports in Tourism. Treks were classified into difficulty categories from I to the 3 or higher in later years, and hikers advanced in rank by completing progressively tougher expeditions. Lyudmila Korovina herself was an experienced trek leader and a master of sports in hiking, reflecting her extensive training and accomplishments. She had led journeys ranging from relatively easy first-category hikes to very challenging fifth-category expeditions. In the early 1990s, a period of post-Soviet transition, the old system of state-sponsored clubs was fading, but the traditions lived on in local clubs like Azimut. These clubs emphasized rigorous preparation, survival skills, and self-reliance in the wilderness, often retaining protocols from Soviet times. Teams typically planned their routes in detail, carried topographic maps and compasses, and coordinated checkpoints or meeting points with other groups. Expedition protocols included obtaining a weather forecast, as Korovina did, packing sufficient provisions, and establishing control points, prearranged rendezvous or contact times when the group was expected to check in or meet others, the hiking party. Korovina's team in 1993 consisted of 7 people in total, 1 adult leader and 6 youths, young adults, all of whom were her students or protégés in the club. They were a tight-knit bunch who had trained together for this adventure. The members of the group were Lyudmila Ivanovna Korovina, 41, the instructor and leader, a tall, energetic woman known for her tough but caring mentorship style. She had a reputation for tough love in training. Students called her Master, both for her formal title and her mastery of survival skills. She lived and breathed hiking, leading school courses in physical education and wilderness skills, and even taking her own daughter on treks. She was a single mother, her 16-year-old daughter Natalia being an avid hiker as well. Tanya Yurevna Filipenko, 24, an experienced hiker and one of the older students in the group. Tanya worked as a secretary at a pedagogical college, yet spent her free time in the mountains. She had already completed several category I and N2 hikes under Korovina's guidance. Enthusiastic and passionate about the outdoors, Tanya eagerly joined the Khamar Daban trip as perhaps the most seasoned member after the leader. Alexander Sasha Gennadyevich Krisin, 23, a university student in Moscow at the Bauman Institute, who had grown up in the Petropavlovsk hiking club. Sasha had joined Azimut around age 12 and fallen in love with the mountains. Despite studying far from home, he rushed back after finishing exams that summer to not miss the Khamar Daban trek. He was physically fit and experienced from years of trekking with Korovina. Denis Viktorovich Shvachkin, 19, the youngest young man on the team. Denis joined somewhat last minute. Another club member originally slated to go had to cancel. His parents kept him home for farm work. So Denis took the open spot. He was familiar with Korovina from the club and was eager to prove himself. Before leaving, he left his vacationing parents a note. Gone to the mountains, be back soon. Confident this trip would be just another successful adventure. Valentina, Valya, Utochenko, 17, a recent graduate of a local pedagogical college and one of the two younger girls on the trek. Valya was studying to be a school crafts teacher and a school tourism instructor, which is how she got involved in the club. She had done a couple of smaller hikes with Korovina previously, including one in the Tian Shan Mountains. Known to be strong and resilient, thanks to a childhood doing farm chores and competitive cross-country skiing, Valentina was nonetheless one of the less experienced in high mountain treks. She would become the sole survivor and key witness of this story. Victoria, Vika, Zalesova, 16, the youngest female member. Vika was a high schooler who loved the idea of adventure. However, she had once shown emotional fragility on a prior winter hike, reportedly breaking down in tears from exhaustion, which made Korovina hesitant to include her this time. Vika was determined to go, and even got her mother, a primary school teacher, to plead with Lyudmila for another chance. She promised she wouldn't complain or let the team down. Finally, Korovina relented and let Vika join the roster. Timur Balgabevich Bapanov, 15, the youngest of all. Timur was practically raised for this. His parents were avid hikers themselves, so he grew up in the mountains, accompanying family on outdoor trips from a young age. Despite being only 15, Timur was hardy and enthusiastic. This Khamar Daban trek was likely his most challenging outing to date, a big step up for the teenager eager to follow in his parents' footsteps. Archival photo of the Korovina group at the outset of their journey, summer 1993. These 7 hikers from Kazakhstan, 1 instructor and 6 young trainees, embarked on what would be a fateful expedition. Together, this diverse group had a common bond, a love of trekking nurtured by the Azimut Club and by Korovina's mentorship. They had spent months preparing for this expedition. According to one club member, Korovina and the students began planning half a year in advance. They charted an exact route and timeline with hourly checkpoints and carefully arranged gear and food. Each person was assigned certain equipment to carry, from tents and cooking supplies to first aid kits. They even drafted a day-by-day menu to ensure a sufficient caloric intake and balanced diet on the trail. The planned menu included grains, dried milk, crackers, tinned meat, stew, root vegetables like carrots and beets, onions, plus treats like candy and chocolate, amounting to roughly 2,400 calories per person per day. In short, nothing was left to chance in preparation. This was to be a major Category 3 trek, considered challenging for mixed experience hikers, covering over 210 kilometers of mountain terrain. The elevation would range up to about 2,371 meters at the highest point, a summit called Kangula, on the Khamar Daban ridge. Lyudmila Korovina wasn't going into these mountains blindly. She had hiked in the Khamar Daban range before and knew the area's quirks. Still, summer weather in the Siberian ranges can be capricious. To be safe, Korovina contacted a meteorological station ahead of time. The forecast she received promised stable, pleasant weather for the duration of their trip. This encouraging news solidified the decision to proceed in early August, with not just her group, but 2 other groups from Kazakhstan as well in the region. In fact, one of those parallel groups was being led by Korovina's own daughter, 16-year-old Natalia. Natalia's team of youths was attempting a similar route in the area as the main group, and Lyudmila's team functioned as a support group meant to be nearby in case Natalia's inexperienced team ran into trouble. The plan was that the 2 groups would intersect at certain points during the trek and specifically meet on a predetermined day near a landmark, a mountain lake called Patov Lake, on August 5th. A 3rd group from Kazakhstan was also hiking elsewhere in Khamar Daban at the same time, underscoring that these mountains were a popular destination that summer. With all plans laid and gear packed, the expedition officially began in the first days of August 1993. The 7 members of Korovina's group took a long train ride from Kazakhstan up to Irkutsk in eastern Siberia, a journey of over 1,500 kilometers that likely took a couple of days. From the city of Irkutsk, they traveled by road to the tiny village of Murino, the trailhead of their hike. On August 2nd, 1993, the Korovina group set off from Murino with high spirits. Their route would take them through river valleys and up onto the spine of the Khamar Daban ridge. According to their route plan, they would trek along the Langute River, pass through the Langute Gates, a mountain pass, then follow the Barun Yunkatsuk River upstream, ascending toward Khan Ula Peak, and traverse along the watershed plateau, dividing the Anikta and Baiga rivers. The schedule was ambitious, but, given their fitness and Korovina's experience, achievable in about a week's time. As they hiked away from civilization, none could have imagined the horrors that lay ahead. All 6 of the young hikers would be dead within days, victims of a still unexplained catastrophe, and Lyudmila Korovina's name would become forever linked with one of Russia's eeriest wilderness mysteries, a tragedy now often dubbed Buryatia's Dyatlov Pass. Episode 2, Into the Wild. The first days of the trek went smoothly, even better than planned. The group moved at a good pace under clear summer skies. By all accounts, morale was high. Being late summer, the mountain weather was mild at lower elevations, likely cool mornings warming to comfortable afternoons. The hikers made steady progress. According to later reports, by the end of day 2, they had already ascended a peak known as Translator, and were ahead of schedule. For these initial days, the forecast held true. Conditions were favorable, and the team was in excellent shape. They practiced standard routines on the trail. The group probably woke up early, broke camp, and hiked for several hours at a time. They took short breaks to rest and have snacks, then continued on. Valentina Utachenko later recalled that they ate hot meals 4 times a day, whenever possible lighting a campfire to cook, despite being on the move. Breakfast might consist of porridge or oatmeal. Lunch, perhaps a soup or stew with canned meat and vegetables. Quick snacks of chocolate or dried fruits were taken during interim breaks. Everyone carried a share of supplies, so no one was overloaded. The camaraderie within the group was evident as they joked and encouraged each other along the trail. In the evenings, they set up a tent camp together. Being summertime, daylight lingered late, but nights in the mountains still grew chilly. The hikers would put on warmer clothes, gather wood, and attempt to build a small fire to prepare dinner and tea. Storytelling or singing around the fire was common on such treks, continuing the old campfire song tradition beloved by Soviet backpackers. It was shaping up to be a memorable adventure for the young tourists. However, a crucial change was brewing in the atmosphere. Unbeknownst to the hikers, a severe weather system was approaching the region. A cyclonic storm front from Mongolia was heading toward Khamar Daban. On August 4th, 1993, as Korovina's group began descending from the high ridges after a successful climb, the weather abruptly turned. What had been a pleasant journey suddenly took a hostile turn. Temperatures plunged, and the sky unleashed a freezing deluge. Cold rain and even wet snow at higher elevations began to fall heavily. Fierce winds picked up, howling over the exposed mountainsides. Visibility deteriorated to nearly zero in swirling mist and precipitation. This development caught the team off guard. They had trusted the earlier forecast of continued good weather, so the onslaught of a Mongolian cyclone came as a nasty surprise. By late on August 4th, the group was forced to make camp under extremely unfavorable conditions. Korovina had to make a quick decision of where to shelter. Unfortunately, and this would later be scrutinized, she chose to hunker down that night on an exposed mountain slope above the tree line, rather than pushing everyone downhill to the forest belt immediately. Possibly it was already dark, or the group was exhausted, and she felt it safer to stop where they were rather than navigate steep terrain in a storm. They attempted to pitch their tents and start a fire to keep warm, but the relentless wind and rain thwarted their efforts. The record indicates that the group failed to get a fire going that night in the driving rain. This meant they likely spent a long, miserable night in cold, damp conditions, huddled in their tents or sleeping bags for any bit of warmth. All around them, the storm raged, with mudslides and minor landslides reported in the area as the torrential rains loosened earth on the slopes. The temperature at those altitudes, around 2,300 meters, may have dropped to near freezing, especially with wind chill. Drenched clothing and gear would not have fully dried. One can imagine the young hikers trying to stay in good spirits despite chattering teeth, perhaps reminding each other, "Hang on until morning." They likely got little sleep as the gale battered their tents. By the pre-dawn hours of August 5th, 1993, the storm had not let up. Korovina was deeply concerned. The situation was deteriorating. This was supposed to be the day they'd meet her daughter's group on the other side of the ridge. But now simply surviving the weather became the priority. Before sunrise, Lyudmila Korovina made a critical decision. They needed to abandon the high ground immediately and descend to the relative safety of the forested valley below. In the forest, trees could provide shelter from the wind, and they could perhaps get a fire lit. It was the only sensible move as exposure on the ridge was growing dangerous. She roused the group at first light, urging everyone to pack up their soaked gear as quickly as possible. The hikers, shivering and tired, complied, stuffing their tents and belongings into backpacks amid the freezing rain. According to Valentina, Korovina was commanding but intent on saving her students. She woke us up, told us to gather our things and head down into the ravine. She was trying to save us. She just didn't succeed in time. These words of Valentina later emphasized that, in her eyes, the leader did everything she could under dire circumstances. At roughly 7 a.m. on August 5th, the 7 hikers began their descent in line, moving as fast as they safely could down the slope. They aimed for the tree line visible below. dark belts of cedar and larch forest that promised a windbreak. The wind was still so strong that the group was more or less sliding downward rather than walking upright. Freezing rain pelted their faces. They were likely half crouched, using their hands and feet to scramble down through slick mud and rocks. This was an emergency retreat from the mountain's wrath. They had descended only a short distance when the unthinkable happened. What began as an ordinary, if nasty, storm scenario suddenly escalated into a nightmare that defies easy explanation. Without warning, one member of the group collapsed in agony, and a chain of deadly events was set in motion. Episode 3: Tragedy on the Mountain. The horror began with a scream. Near the back of the line of hikers, Alexander Krysin, 23, suddenly cried out. Valentina Utachenko, who was nearby, heard Sasha begin to scream in terror or pain. The others turned to see what was happening. What they saw was utterly alarming. Alexander was staggering and covered in blood. Blood was gushing from his nose, and horrifyingly, it was also coming from his eyes and ears. He was frothing at the mouth, foam mixed with blood, and his body was convulsing violently. Sasha dropped to the ground, writhing in seizure, then went eerily still. Lyudmila Korovina reacted immediately. She ran to Alexander's side, desperately trying to help him or get him to regain consciousness. One can only imagine her shock. Moments before, the primary concern was the cold, and now one of her healthiest hikers was collapsing as if poisoned. As she reached Sasha, calling his name, Korovina herself suddenly let out a cry. She was hit by the same affliction. Her body started convulsing. Foam appeared at her mouth, and she collapsed on top of Alexander's prone form. The strong 41-year-old leader was now down, twitching uncontrollably, then going limp. Panic swept through the remaining hikers. Tatiana Filipenko, 24, rushed toward Lyudmila to assist. But as Tanya reached her fallen leader, she too succumbed to a bizarre fate. According to Valentina's account, Tatiana grabbed at her own throat as if she couldn't breathe, choking on something unseen. Gasping, Tatiana fell to her knees. In an apparent state of delirium or agony, she began smashing her head against a rock repeatedly until her body went limp on the ground. The others watched in absolute terror as their friend essentially beat herself to death, an act utterly incomprehensible under normal circumstances. At this point, the group was in disarray. Victoria Zalesova, 16, and Timur Bapanov, 15, the two youngest, were overcome with raw fear. They broke into a run down the slope, attempting to flee whatever invisible killer was attacking their team. As they sprinted, they both collapsed as well. Valentina later described that Vika and Timur fell to the ground while running and began vomiting blood and clawing at their necks. They tore at their clothing in a frenzy, a detail often noted that they were found partially undressed, possibly from disorientation or a sensation of burning heat, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing in severe hypothermia, though here the cause was unclear. Within moments, both teenagers were dead. Now only Valentina Utachenko, 17, and Denis Shvachkin, 19, remained alive and conscious on the mountain. In the span of minutes, 5 of their companions had collapsed, a gruesome tableau of blood, foam, and lifeless bodies scattered on the cold ground. It must have felt like a scene from a nightmare or a horror film, as Valentina would later describe. It was like a horror movie. Everyone was falling. Everyone had blood, foam from the mouth, blood flowing from the nose. She could not comprehend whether this was real or how it could be happening so fast. Valentina and Denis were gripped by sheer terror. They did not know what was killing their friends. Was it the cold? Some toxic gas? A deadly illness striking instantaneously? In such a panicked state, the instinct to survive kicked in. Dennis shouted to Valentina that they had to get out of there. He effectively saved Valentina's life in that moment by not succumbing to complete panic. Dennis began kicking Valya's legs and urging her, "Crawl down, get down the mountain." He was pushing her to flee, even as he stayed behind her as a rear guard. The two scrambled further downhill, leaving the cluster of bodies behind. But after just a short distance, Denis Shvachkin too collapsed. He fell, convulsing as Alexander had, foam coming from his mouth. Valentina was now the last one standing. In the chaos, even a brief delay could be fatal. She had seen Dennis go down not far behind her. At this point, something perhaps snapped in Valentina's psyche. She continued moving, propelled by fear and adrenaline, scarcely able to process that 6 of her friends and her mentor lay dead or dying on the mountain behind her. In a matter of 15 to 30 minutes, the unthinkable had occurred. The entire group, except Valentina, had perished suddenly and violently. Later reports and Valentina's own recollections paint a chilling sequence. Alexander was stricken first with bleeding orifices and seizures. Lyudmila and then Tatiana quickly followed, succumbing to convulsions or frenzy. Victoria and Timur tried to run, but died in hysterics. Dennis lasted a bit longer, helping Valentina before he too fell. The precise timeline of each collapse is hard to pin down, as Valentina admitted her sense of time during this living nightmare was distorted. It might have been mere minutes or up to an hour, but it was extremely rapid for 6 young, previously healthy people to all die. One moment the group was battling a natural storm. The next, they were seemingly attacked by an invisible force. The symptoms reported: bleeding from facial orifices, foaming at the mouth, convulsions, irrational violent behavior like Tatiana's self-injury and Victoria's biting and hysteria. Do not align neatly with any common mountaineering ailment like hypothermia alone. It was as if some toxin or chemical had suddenly poisoned them, or as if they collectively went mad. The scene was so outlandish that local rescuers later struggled to believe hypothermia could be solely responsible. Indeed, 2 experienced searchers, Valery Tatanikov and Vladimir Zinov, insisted it was impossible for the hikers to die of cold in such a manner, given that it was summertime. Zinov conjectured maybe altitude sickness had triggered deadly edema in their lungs. Others speculated about infrasound from the storm winds causing panic or organ damage. We will return to these theories later in detail. But at this moment on August 5th, Valentina had no time to theorize. She was in fight or flight survival mode, utterly alone. Episode 4. Alone in the taiga. Valentina. Utochenko was now faced with an unimaginable situation. At just 17 years old, she was stranded alone in the Siberian wilderness, traumatized, half-frozen, and without her guide or group. But she was alive. An instinct drove her to survive. After Denis Shvachkin's collapse, Valya kept moving downhill until she finally reached the relative shelter of the forest. By now, the morning light had grown, and in the forest canopy, the winds were less punishing. She found a spot under dense trees and decided to make a temporary camp there. Valentina quickly pitched the small tent she had carried, possibly a 1 or 2 person tent, or fashioned a basic shelter and crawled inside. Soaked, shivering, and in shock, she climbed into a sleeping bag to warm up. There, exhaustion and trauma caught up with her, and she fell into a deep sleep or stupor. She later recounted that she wasn't sure if it was truly sleep or a kind of blackout. Her body and mind simply shut down for a time to recover. When Valentina awoke, it was likely late morning or midday on August 5th. The storm might have begun to ease by then, although conditions were still cold and wet. Now somewhat rested and slightly warmer, Valentina forced herself to confront the grim reality. She knew her friends were dead. She had seen enough in those horrifying moments to understand that none of the others could have survived. Despite that, she summoned incredible courage. Valentina decided to go back up to the death site to collect essential supplies. This was a remarkably brave act, given the trauma it must have induced to walk among her fallen comrades. She climbed back up to where the bodies lay sprawled on the slope. In silent anguish, Valentina closed the eyes of each of her deceased friends as a mark of respect, one of the only final rites she could offer them in that lonely place. She then gathered what she needed to survive. She took a map and compass, critical for navigation, from Lyudmila Korovina's belongings. She likely also collected any remaining food she could carry, and perhaps an axe or knife, matches, and warm clothing layers from the packs of the others. It's noted that she took supplies from their bodies, implying she had to overcome horror to rifle through her friends' packs or pockets. She worked efficiently, knowing staying there too long was dangerous and agonizing. There was nothing more she could do for the dead, and lingering would only risk her own life if the weather turned again, or if whatever killed them was still present. Equipped with navigation tools and provisions, Valentina started a desperate journey to get help. She had the presence of mind to recall that they had passed power transmission lines, utility poles, somewhere in the vicinity earlier in the hike. Such lines usually lead to inhabited areas or facilities, so she headed downhill, looking for signs of these power lines. Incredibly, she managed to find them. Tall posts or pylons cutting through the forest, perhaps serving a remote meteorological station or village. She then made a fateful choice. She followed the power lines, reasoning correctly that they would eventually lead her to civilization, or at least to a river that could guide her out. For the next 4 days, Valentina trekked alone through the Siberian taiga, fighting fatigue, hunger, and psychological despair. She later said it felt like someone or something was guiding me the whole time, down the mountain, as if a guardian angel was helping her navigate. In reality, it was likely her survival training and tenacity guiding her steps. But one can forgive her for feeling there was a higher power at work. Surviving this ordeal was nothing short of miraculous. During her solo descent, Valentina eventually encountered a river, which turned out to be the Snezhnaya River, meaning snowy river. This river flowed north toward populated areas. She changed her strategy slightly and began following the river downstream, figuring it would lead to people. Often hikers are taught that following water downstream leads to settlements. She was cold, likely without a way to make fire. Perhaps her matches were wet, or she was too exhausted each night. She survived on the scant food she had taken, possibly dry crackers or chocolate. There are accounts that at some point she managed to wash herself and even wash her clothes in the river, perhaps to rid them of blood or dirt, though her memory of doing so was hazy later. The kayakers who found her recalled she appeared relatively clean and had laundered her shirt. At times, Valentina moved in a daze, stumbling through dense forest, crossing streams, clambering over fallen logs. She was in a psychological haze, likely replaying the nightmare in her head, even as she forced herself to put one foot in front of the other. She later described feeling intermittently that she might be losing her sanity. but she pushed on with the basic goal of reaching help before collapsing. She might have kept talking to herself or praying to stay focused. The fact that she did not succumb to despair is a testament to her resilience. In her own humble analysis, Valentina attributes her survival to her tough rural upbringing and endurance. She had been used to hard physical labor and not giving up easily. I always was hardy, not afraid of difficulties and physical burdens. Probably that's why I survived, she reflected later. Finally, on the fourth day of her ordeal, August 9th, 1993, salvation arrived. A group of Ukrainian tourists on a kayaking trip down the Snezhnaya River spotted something unusual on the shore. As they navigated their catarafts down the rapids, they saw a lone girl on the riverbank, frantically waving her arms and shouting for help. The kayakers, realizing she was in distress, quickly paddled to the side. The first person who jumped ashore was met by Valentina running toward them. She collapsed into the arms of a female kayaker, sobbing uncontrollably. One of the kayakers, Alexander Kvitnitsky, later described the scene. My heart clenches when I remember that sight. There's a young girl standing on the bank, screaming, waving her arms, so desperately that we understood at once trouble. When we came ashore, she threw herself at one of our women and cried on her chest for a long time. She blurted out brokenly that people had died and she was scared. The burly river-tour men and women were stunned to encounter a teenager alone in such a remote area, clearly traumatized. The kayakers administered immediate first aid and comfort to Valentina. They built a fire, gave her warm clothes or blankets, and some hot food and drink. She was shaking and hysterical, so they gave her calming drops, valerian tincture, and corvalol, a heart sedative, to help settle her nerves. As she recovered a bit on the journey back, the kayakers took her onto their rafts and continued downriver with her. Valentina even contributed to camp tasks in a dazed autopilot. At one point, she insisted on helping cook, frying flatbread for her rescuers on a pan lid as a gesture of thanks. The group noted how surreal it was that she could still function in such ways despite her shock. The kayakers transported Valentina to the nearest village with a police station, the town of Sludyanka, which lies on the southern end of Lake Baikal. There, on August 9th, 1993, an official report was filed with the authorities about the incident. The lone survivor had made it out, but she was in no condition to provide a coherent account immediately. Upon reaching safety, Valentina became mute, withdrawn into herself. Police and doctors noted that Utochenko did not speak for several days. The shock had rendered her unable or unwilling to relive the trauma just yet. Given her state, the details of what happened on the mountain remained unclear to rescuers for some time. Valentina's survival was nothing short of miraculous. Out of 7, she alone escaped what befell the others. Later, she humbly said she survived by God's help and the grace of a guardian angel. Whether by divine providence, her friend Denis's last efforts, or her own grit, likely all three, Valentina lived to tell the tale of the Khamar Daban tragedy. But the story was far from over. 6 bodies remained somewhere up in those mountains, and a perplexing investigation was about to unfold. Episode 5: Search and Recovery. Once Valentina Utochenko was in the care of authorities on August 9th, 1993, a search and recovery operation for the rest of the group needed to be organized. However, things did not proceed as swiftly or smoothly as one might expect for such a dire situation. Several factors contributed to a significant delay in the official search. First, Valentina was catatonic and unable to give a clear statement initially. The police in Sliudyanka had a report of multiple deaths in the mountains, but they lacked precise coordinates or even a basic idea of where on the vast Khamar Daban range to look. Additionally, the inclement weather persisted in the region for many days after the tragedy. Heavy rains, fog, and wind continued to lash the mountains, making helicopter flights hazardous or impossible. In fact, rescuers later said that continuous bad weather prevented helicopters from taking off to search the area for nearly 2 weeks. It wasn't until August 24, 1993, a full 19 days after the group's demise, that a formal search team finally located the bodies. The effort was led by Yuri Golios, a decorated rescue service veteran, later described as an honored rescuer of Russia. Golios and his team had begun searching around August 22nd, once they had a general idea of where the group might be, likely deduced from the planned route and whatever scanned info Valentina eventually provided after recovering enough to talk. It still took a couple of days for them to find the site. Ironically, the discovery occurred somewhat by accident. During the search, the rescue party was also involved in aiding another group of lost hikers from Omsk, and in the process they stumbled upon the Korovina group's last camp. What they found was gruesome and heart-wrenching. The bodies of Lyudmila Korovina and her 5 deceased students were found together near their last campsite, on an open slope just above the tree line where Valentina had left them. Reports indicate they were near a small camp setup, possibly the tent Valentina pitched and left, or scattered belongings from the chaotic evacuation. The state of the corpses was extremely distressing. Nearly 3 weeks of exposure to the elements and scavengers had taken a heavy toll. Rescuers noted the bodies were deformed and partially consumed by wildlife, rodents and birds. The term izurодованные trupy, mutilated corpses, was used in some accounts. This complicating factor meant that some forensic evidence might have been lost or contaminated. Notably, the bodies were observed to be in varying states of undress, some partially clothed or missing garments. This could be due to a phenomenon in fatal hypothermia, where victims paradoxically remove clothing in late stages, or it could be from their panicked disrobing during the mysterious incident. It's also possible scavenging animals moved or removed some clothing. In any case, this detail was consistent with Valentina's story of some tearing their clothes off while dying. Photographs were taken, and the remains were carefully collected. It must have been a chilling scene, even for veteran rescuers. One can imagine the hush among them as they processed the reality. 6 young people dead together on a summer mountainside with no obvious cause. The bodies were transported out of the mountains, likely by helicopter once the weather permitted, to the regional center for autopsy. News of the tragedy, which had already spread in Petropavlovsk, now had confirmation with the recovery of the deceased. In Petropavlovsk, a city of around 200,000 people, the loss of 6 local youth and a beloved instructor caused tremendous shock and grief. A mass funeral was held, reportedly attended by nearly the whole town. All the coffins were kept closed due to the condition of the bodies. People mourned not only the individuals, but the shattering of a community's sense of safety in their cherished outdoor pursuits. The entire Azimut Club effectively disbanded after the tragedy, unable to continue under the weight of what happened. Parents lost children. A daughter lost her mother. Korovina's own daughter, Natalia, survived only because she was on a different mountain that week. The collective trauma was profound. Yet even amid the mourning, controversies and questions began bubbling. At the funeral and in town, rumors and blame started to circulate. shock turned to speculation. How could this happen? Was someone responsible? In particular, some pointed fingers at Lyudmila Korovina, the leader who was no longer alive to defend herself. Not long after the tragedy, at least one news article, supposedly in a major paper, alleged that Korovina had been negligent and essentially caused the deaths by poor decision-making. This infuriated those who knew Lyudmila, as it painted her as reckless or incompetent, which they vehemently rejected. Valentina Yaskova, a close friend of Korovina, recalled that the accusation was discussed even on the trams around town and brought immense pain to the grieving families. Parents of the victims were horrified that their children's mentor was being blamed publicly with no evidence. The mother of Timur Bapanov, for instance, defended Lyudmila. "I trusted Lyudmila like I trust myself. She was a professional. She could not have killed her group." Emotions were raw, and this rift in narratives, hero instructor versus accused culprit, complicated the aftermath. Adding to the mystique, a sensational rumor took hold in Petropavlovsk. Some locals believed the hikers might have stumbled into a secret military weapons test zone, and that Valentina had been silenced by the security services. According to this conspiracy theory, the KGB, or its post-Soviet successor, rescued Valia and forced her to sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding her from revealing what really occurred. People pointed to her subsequent reclusiveness. She left Petropavlovsk shortly after recovery and never spoke to press, as evidence that the government was hiding something. This, of course, was speculative and not supported by tangible evidence. It likely arose from the eerie parallels to the Dyatlov Pass incident, which has many conspiracy theories, and the vacuum of solid answers initially. Nevertheless, such rumors underscore how the Khamar Daban incident had already begun to take on an air of mystery and suspicion in the public mind. Before we delve into theories, though, we must examine the official investigation and forensic findings, what science and authorities concluded, and what they might have overlooked. Episode 6: Investigation and Autopsy. The official investigation into the Khamar Daban incident was carried out by local authorities in Buryatia and nearby Irkutsk, where the bodies were examined. Given the unusual circumstances, one would expect a meticulous inquiry. However, the conclusion reached by investigators was surprisingly straightforward. They attributed the death to hypothermia, death by exposure, and in one case, a heart attack. Let's break down what the autopsies and reports actually stated. The autopsies were performed in the city of Ulan-Ude, the capital of Buryatia. Forensic examiners identified signs consistent with hypothermia in all 6 deceased hikers. Specifically, all had bruising in the lungs. Pulmonary edema or fluid accumulation can appear as bruising. This is indeed a common finding in fatal hypothermia cases. The lungs can show congestion and edema. Additionally, 5 of the 6, everyone except the leader Korovina, were determined to have died directly from generalized hypothermia, freezing, as the primary cause of death. In Lyudmila Korovina's case, her cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, a heart attack. It's possible this meant stress or cold, induced a heart failure in her specifically. A curious note in the autopsy report was that all victims showed signs of protein deficiency, protein depletion, and malnutrition in their muscle tissues. This suggests muscle wasting, or that their bodies were in a starved state. Investigators posited that malnutrition might have been a contributing factor that made them less able to withstand the cold. However, the group had been out only a few days. They had ample food initially, so such protein deficiency struck many as dubious or indicative of something else. Some wondered if it meant they had not been eating enough during the hike, maybe due to exertion or stress, or if an unknown pathological process caused rapid muscle breakdown. Importantly, the forensic examination did not find any obvious external injuries, besides those possibly self-inflicted by Tatiana hitting her head on a rock, which presumably would have shown trauma. There were no fractures, no stab wounds, no gunshot wounds, no signs of external violence inflicted by an attacker. This ruled out an animal attack or interpersonal violence, aligning with Valentina's account that no one had attacked them. There was also no mention of severe internal organ damage beyond the lungs. For instance, no mention of hemorrhaging in the brain or such. If there was, it wasn't publicized. In short, nothing concrete to explain the bizarre bleeding and convulsions was documented, beyond what could be ascribed to hypothermia, or perhaps stress-induced physiological breakdown. Thus, the official cause given was that the group likely became hypothermic after failing to shelter properly in the storm, leading to irrational behavior and ultimately death. Case closed. However, this explanation rang hollow on many levels, and numerous details didn't add up, even to those without medical expertise. How could 6 people die of hypothermia within minutes of each other in August? Hypothermia is usually a gradual process, except in cases of sudden immersion in freezing water. Yet the group's deaths were almost simultaneous and accompanied by acute symptoms like bleeding and frothing. Hypothermia can cause confusion and paradoxical undressing, but it doesn't typically cause frothy blood from the mouth and nose in the terminal phase, unless perhaps the person develops pulmonary edema. The description of events sounded far more acute and violent than a slow freezing. Why did the autopsy not identify any toxin or pathogen? If not hypothermia, was it possible they ingested or encountered something poisonous? The case file available publicly does not mention toxicology results in detail. Perhaps some basic toxicology was done and came back negative for common poisons, e.g., no signs of carbon monoxide, etc. But speculation remained that not all toxins would show up in standard screens. For instance, certain natural neurotoxins or military chemicals might not be tested for. What about the environment? The investigators did not indicate any environmental cause like a gas. Could a sudden release of some underground gas, like pockets of ozone or other chemicals from a storm or seismic activity, have occurred? One experienced hiker, Evgeny Olkovsky, later suggested the group might have encountered a high concentration of ozone generated by the storm's lightning, effectively poisoning them. This was not something the official report explored. Valentina's condition. She survived 4 days after the incident. Hypothermia can cause temporary issues, but she recovered fully, apart from trauma. If a chemical agent was involved, one might expect lingering health effects in her. Yet aside from stress, she physically recovered. This both supports and complicates various theories. HEETG, maybe a specific nerve gas dissipated and she had a sublethal dose. Negligence or not? Some officials, notably Yuri Golius, who led the search, publicly criticized Lyudmila Korovina's decisions. Golius suggested that Korovina starved her students as a test of endurance, which, combined with exposure, led to their collapse. He pointed to finding only 1 empty can of stew at the site, inferring they had hardly eaten. This directly contradicted Valentina Utochenko's testimony, where she insisted they ate 4 times a day and had plenty of calories, denying that they were ever severely exhausted or hungry. Many experts and friends also found it puzzling why Korovina camped on a wind-blown ridge instead of descending to the forest at the first sign of bad weather. Was this a grave mistake born of overconfidence? Or was there some reason? Perhaps they were caught above tree line unexpectedly at nightfall. The investigation did not thoroughly probe this. It seemed easier to tacitly accept that the leader erred, due to perhaps arrogance or an intense personality, as some speculated. Valentina Utochenko, when she finally spoke years later, defended Korovina strongly. By no means was she at fault. On the summit, it was very cold. She tried to save us. She just didn't manage to. Valentina felt Korovina did everything reasonable given the sudden weather. Missing pieces. The Russia Beyond article on the case pointed out a list of perplexing questions left unanswered by the official case. Why would Korovina lead the group down the bare upper arm of the ridge when they could have taken the forested trail? What caused the gruesome bleeding? What about the protein deficiency if they ate well? How could 6 die in minutes? And finally, how did the 7th survive? These were exactly the points that armchair detectives would seize upon in later analyses. In summary, the authorities closed the case, attributing it largely to an unfortunate encounter with a storm and poor judgment. The death certificates likely read hypothermia for most, which in a bureaucratic sense ended the matter. No criminal investigation was pursued since there was no evidence of foul play by outsiders. In the turmoil of 1993, Russia, just 2 years after the Soviet collapse, resources for prolonged investigations were scarce, and the country's focus was on many other crises, so the Khamar Daban incident quietly joined the annals of solved cases, at least on paper. But for the families, for Valentina, and for the wider hiking community, this was far from settled. What really happened up there? The dissonance between the official explanation and the eyewitness account fueled a sense that something was being overlooked. Over the years, through personal testimonies and investigative journalism, a clearer, if still puzzling, picture formed, and several theories arose. Before exploring those theories, it's crucial to hear directly from the sole survivor. Valentina Utochenko's own story, as the only eyewitness, is our primary window into the event. Yet even her testimony has evolved and been scrutinized, which we examine next. Episode 7. The Survivor's Testimony. Valentina Utochenko's account of the tragedy is the cornerstone of understanding the Khamar Daban incident. However, obtaining her full testimony proved challenging. In the immediate aftermath, as noted, she was virtually mute from shock for days. She likely gave a brief official statement to police around August 10th or 11th, after she had physically recovered enough. That initial statement, 1993, was on record, but not widely published at the time. Then Valentina disappeared from the public eye. Traumatized, she refused to speak to any journalists or outsiders about what happened for decades. She left Kazakhstan and tried to start a new life elsewhere, carrying her scars in silence. For 25 years, she was essentially a silent witness, fueling those conspiracy speculations that she was forced into silence. It wasn't until 2018 that a determined journalist from Komsomolskaya Pravda, Natalia Vasegova, managed to track Valentina down and persuade her to talk. This was a breakthrough. Valentina, now in her early 40s, finally recounted in detail what she remembered, on record. We have already incorporated much of that narrative, the timeline of events, from her perspective. But here we consider the nuances and discrepancies of her testimony over time. Valentina's 1993 statement versus 2018 interview. By comparing sources, a few differences emerge. In her 1993 explanation letter, as referenced by Varsegova, Valentina mentioned that they cooked on portable stoves, primers, because they were above tree line, whereas in 2018, she told the journalist she didn't remember using primer stoves and believed they cooked on campfires in the forest whenever possible. The journalist parenthetically noted this discrepancy, suggesting memory gaps are possible after so long. This is a minor detail, but shows how memory can blur. Presence of blood. Some sources claim Valentina's initial police report did not emphasize blood. However, the Russia Beyond Peace says in her statement she described bleeding from ears, which matches what we know. The later telling in 2018 definitely includes the vivid blood details. It's possible early Western reports or translations underplayed that element, causing confusion. Screams and panic. There's a note that in some earlier accounts, it said she claimed there were no screams, but that seems to conflict with the core story that Sasha screamed. Perhaps what she meant is that after the initial cries, the others died in silence aside from gurgling, or that her memory was chaotic. Explorers Webb mentions she said there were no screams in one account versus screams in another. This could be a translation issue or trauma-related memory variance. Her actions after. One rumor in English forums was that Valia emerged covered in blood and screaming, versus quiet and in shock, depending on the source. The kayaker's quote shows she was indeed screaming on the bank and hysterical at rescue, so likely the quiet, blank-staring version was an embellished retelling by someone else or confusion with her later shutdown. She might have been screaming to get attention, then gone catatonic after being safe. Suspicion on Valentina. Because she alone survived, some outsiders mused if she could have had a hand in the others' deaths, an admittedly far-fetched idea. In truth, there's no evidence to suspect foul play by her. It would be practically impossible for a 17-year-old girl to physically overpower and kill 6 people in that manner. The notion likely arose from frustration at the mystery. Humans sometimes look for a culprit, even when there is none. This theory is not taken seriously by any credible investigators. Valentina herself was never accused by authorities of wrongdoing. Valentina's own theory. Notably, in her 2018 interview, Valentina offered her personal belief on the cause. She thought it was high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, essentially, altitude sickness that led to fluid in the lungs and madness. She said, "It seems a lung edema began. By the symptoms it fits: foam, blood from the mouth, insanity." This aligns with what rescuer Zenov suggested as well. However, many specialists have countered that the altitude approximately 2,300 meters was not high enough for fatal altitude sickness in people who had only been at elevation a couple of days. Typically, HAPE occurs above 2,500 to 3,000 meters, and especially if ascending rapidly. Khamar Daban's peaks just touch that threshold, but not usually deadly for acclimatized hikers. Still, individuals vary, and severe stress and cold could exacerbate it. Valentina's belief in this explanation perhaps gave her a framework to cope. It was a natural medical phenomenon, not something supernatural or malicious. In her extended 2018 narrative to Varsegova, Valentina provided a coherent chronological retelling. From the preparation, the early trek, the storm, to each person's collapse, her escape, the rescue and aftermath. She detailed little human touches, like Korovina hugging Sasha as he convulsed, Dennis kicking her to get moving, her closing her friend's eyes, and her making bread for the kayakers, that only someone who lived it could recount. These lend credibility to her testimony. She comes across as sincere, deeply traumatized but rational in describing facts as she remembered them. The consistency of core elements between 1993 and 2018 is notable. In both, she describes foam at the mouth, bleeding, bizarre behavior, Tanya's head banging, etc., and quick deaths. That consistency, along with rescue and forensic evidence, like the undressed bodies, etc., strongly corroborates that something extraordinary befell the group. It's not a tale she made up whole cloth. When speaking to the journalist, Valentina also conveyed how deeply the experience scarred her life. She kept it secret even from her husband for 15 years. He only found out by chance when a TV show about the incident showed her photo in the early 2000s. One can imagine the survivor's guilt and PTSD she must have carried. She mentioned that after she finally told her parents the full story, sometime after returning home in 1993, her body reacted somatically. Her arms, legs, and back stopped working temporarily, and she had to be hospitalized for a month or two due to the psychological and physical breakdown. This indicates severe trauma. In summary, Valentina Utachenko's testimony is both our most vital piece of evidence and one that must be understood in light of trauma. Trauma can cause memory gaps or distortions, yet the broad strokes of her story have been corroborated by physical evidence. Investigators acknowledge that traumatized survivors might misremember certain details, times, sequences, but there's no reason to doubt the horrific symptoms she witnessed. Even if, say, the bleeding was not as profuse as she recalls, or the timeline was faster or slower, the essence is clear. Her group died in a sudden, violent manner that was not a simple case of quietly lying down to freeze. Having heard from Valentina, and considering the investigation's shortcomings, we are left with a puzzle that demands explanation. What could possibly cause such an incident? Over the years, experts and amateurs alike have proposed a range of theories. We will now delve into those, weighing the evidence for each. Episode 8: Theories and Explanations. The Khamar Daban tragedy has inspired numerous theories, much like the Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, which it eerily resembles in mystery. No single theory perfectly accounts for all observations, but each offers some insight. We will explore the major hypotheses, from the mundane to the exotic, along with their pros and cons, supported by what evidence is available. 8.1 Hypothermia and exposure. Official version. The simplest explanation is the one given by officials. The hikers died of hypothermia, accelerated by exhaustion, and possibly worsened by hunger. In this view, the intense cold rain and wind on the night of August 4th to 5th caused their body temperatures to plummet. By early morning, they were hypothermic, which can lead to confusion, hallucinations, and erratic behavior. Paradoxical undressing, a known phenomenon in late-stage hypothermia, where people feel hot and remove clothes, could explain why some were partially undressed when found. The bleeding and foam might be attributed to pulmonary edema, fluid in lungs, as the autopsy indeed noted fluid in lungs, often present in hypothermia fatalities. Tatiana's self-injury could be seen as an extreme delirious reaction. Essentially, the storm killed them, and the rest is distorted memory from a traumatized survivor. Arguments for this theory. The group was caught in severe weather, unprotected on a mountain. Hypothermia is a very real threat even in summer if conditions are bad enough. Once core body temperature drops, death can come surprisingly fast. Some of Valentina's descriptions align with severe hypothermia symptoms, irrational behavior, undressing, and terminal burrowing. She found one member, Dennis, trying to crawl into a sleeping bag in a panic, possibly seeking warmth. The autopsy explicitly listed hypothermia as cause and found physical signs consistent with it, lung fluid, etc. It's a non-extraordinary explanation, Occam's razor. No need to invoke secret weapons or rare toxins if a known condition can account for it. Arguments against. Hypothermia typically doesn't cause dramatic bleeding from eyes, ears as reported. While cold can cause some blood from extreme frostbite or bursting of small vessels, the described bleeding seems too acute. Even the foam is more characteristic of edema or toxin than plain cold. The timeline. It's unusual for 6 people to all collapse near simultaneously from hypothermia. Usually, people would succumb at different times unless they were all exactly equally exposed and had no chance to react. Here, it seems one was hit, then within minutes everyone was down. With hypothermia, one might expect a slower, staggered decline. The group had been active and hiking just prior, which generates body heat. They also did manage to get a fire in the morning and have breakfast, per Wikipedia. That should have staved off hypothermia a bit. If anything, dawn and activity could improve their condition. Valentina herself survived the same weather and even slept out overnight after. If pure exposure was the cause, why didn't she also become fatally hypothermic? One could argue Dennis's actions helped her get lower, warmer quicker, or sheer luck/genetics. She was very hardy, but it's a point to consider. Some have suggested a compound scenario. The group may have already been weakened by something, like undereating, and then hypothermia struck. Golias's assertion that Korovina might have enforced a kind of survival training by not feeding them properly at the last camp ties into this. If indeed they were calorie deprived and exhausted, their hypothermia threshold would be lower. The autopsy's note on protein deficiency lends a bit of credence to them being in a depleted state, though that could also simply result from the body's stress after death. In conclusion, hypothermia alone seems insufficient to explain all the observed phenomena, but it was certainly a major factor in the situation. It could be that hypothermia was the final blow, even if another trigger started the calamity. 8.2 Acute altitude sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema. Valentina Utachenko and rescuer Vladimir Zinov championed the idea that the group succumbed to a form of acute mountain sickness, specifically high altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. HAPE occurs when, at high elevations, pressure causes fluid to leak into the lungs. It can strike relatively quickly and causes extreme difficulty breathing, coughing up foamy fluid, sometimes blood-tinged, and can lead to collapse and death. It's often accompanied by confusion, lack of oxygen, and even irrational behavior. If several members got HAPE and possibly high-altitude cerebral edema, brain swelling too, it might look like what happened: frothy blood from mouth, disorientation, collapse. Korovina's cause of death being a heart attack could actually fit, as HAPE can induce cardiac arrest. Arguments for: the symptoms of foam at the mouth and asphyxiation align with pulmonary edema, which Valentina explicitly believes happened. Autopsy did show fluid in lungs for all. It could strike multiple people if all are exerting heavily and perhaps have a genetic predisposition, or all went from low altitude, Kazakh plains, to greater than 2,300 meters in a short span. They started at likely near sea level at Lake Baikal, Merino, on August 2nd, and by August 4th, were at 2,300 plus meters. That's a pretty quick ascent, potentially not giving enough acclimatization. Some might handle it, others not. In fact, in the Dyatlov group, 1959, one theory for the two who had frothy fluids was that they inhaled snow while unconscious, but in some analyses they considered pulmonary edema from cold or altitude as well. If one person got HAPE and collapsed, Sasha, the stress and shock could have triggered similar crises in others who were borderline. HAPE and hypothermia could also interact. Cold can worsen altitude effects. Arguments against, as noted, the altitude of approximately 2,300 meters, 7,800 feet, is not extremely high. While HAPE can occur in some people above approximately 2,000 meters, it's relatively rare that it would kill multiple people at that moderate altitude, especially as they were only on day 3 or 4 of the hike. Usually, HAPE is seen above 3,000 meters in those who ascend too fast. The group members were young and fit, and Korovina had prior experience at altitude, Tian Shan, Altai, etc., which likely means she and maybe some others had been higher than this before without incident. For all 6 to be fatally stricken virtually simultaneously by altitude sickness is extremely unlikely. Normally, one person might get sick and others would help. If it were HAPE, why didn't at least 1 or 2 have milder cases? Valentina having none is notable, but 1 survivor is possible. There were other groups in the area at similar heights, Natalia's group nearby. They did not report any altitude issues at that time, as far as known. Some experts outright reject altitude sickness as the cause, given the height was too low for such a severe outcome in multiple people. Yet, Valentina's own conviction in this theory is strong, perhaps because it is a plausible, non-nefarious answer that fits much of what she saw. It might be that altitude played a role in a cascade of events, perhaps some mild altitude illness, plus hypothermia, plus shock together. 8.3. Infrasound and weather-induced panic. One of the more intriguing natural theories involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can be generated by wind under certain topographic conditions. Infrasound is inaudible to humans, but has been documented to cause physiological and psychological distress, anxiety, nausea, dizziness, and even organ damage at high intensities. Some researchers have speculated that a combination of the storm's high winds and the specific shape of the mountains could have created a perfect storm of infrasound that bombarded the hikers. This theory gained traction by analogy to a Dyatlov Pass hypothesis. In Dyatlov, it's been postulated that winds around the mountain Kholat-Syakhl produced a Kármán vortex street effect, generating infrasound that caused the hikers to panic irrationally and flee. In Khamar Daban, rescuers like Nikolai Fedorov suggested something similar. The hikers might have essentially gone mad due to infrasounds. The idea is the intense wind on the ridge could have created vibrations or acoustic pressure that led to extreme panic, disorientation, and physical symptoms, like resonance in organs causing pain or bleeding. Arguments for sudden onset of terror. Infrasound could in theory instill unreasoning panic and physical discomfort out of nowhere, which might align with Sasha's sudden scream and the chaos that followed, absent other triggers. Korovina's heart attack. Infrasound can cause stress on the cardiovascular system. Conceivably, it might trigger a cardiac arrest in someone susceptible, if Lyudmila had an undetected heart condition perhaps. The rescuer's comment about could cause cardiac arrest or organ rupture lines up. Tatiana's behavior, head banging. If severe infrasound caused unbearable internal pain or mental agony, one might do anything to escape it, even knocking oneself unconscious. It's speculative but possible. There is scientific support that high-intensity infrasound can cause hallucinations, fear, and internal damage if exposed long enough. A German study is cited noting organ damage after an hour of infrasound exposure. The hikers might not have been exposed that long, but perhaps a powerful burst could do something. Environmental conditions. The storm winds were extremely strong, and the mountain topography, gaps, ridges, might have created the right conditions. Notably, katabatic winds, sudden downward gusts of cold air, were present, and these can come with infrasound. Explorers Web notes, cold air rushing down a mountain can bring hypothermia quickly and possibly generate infrasonic vibrations. Arguments against. Infrasound is hard to prove occurred and even harder to link definitively to the injuries observed. There's no direct measurement from that day. While it might cause panic and some physical distress, bleeding from the ears and foaming at the mouth are not commonly reported effects of infrasound exposure. Those lean more toward chemical or pressure-related injury. Could infrasound cause lung edema? Unlikely, unless it led them to hyperventilate severely or something indirect. For all 6 to die, something more concrete than just panic must have happened. In Dyatlov's case, if infrasound theory were true, it caused them to flee, but they ultimately died of hypothermia outside. In Khamar Daban, they died on the spot, which implies more than just running blindly. If infrasound was present, why didn't Valentina die too? Possibly she was slightly farther when it peaked, or just luckier, but she was in the same area. Unless the idea is that all had irreversible damage and she was the only one who managed to recover. The infrasound theory often is combined with others. For instance, infrasound-induced panic leading to mistakes that then lead to hypothermia or accidents. Explorers Web in fact suggests it as one of 2 likely causes, the other being nerve agent, noting it could explain Korovina's heart failure and the general hysteria. It remains a plausible contributing factor in a multi-factor scenario, but by itself, it doesn't fully account for the quick, lethal physiological effects. 8.4 Poisoning. Water or food contamination. Another line of thought is that the hikers were poisoned by something they ingested, either through water or food. Contaminated water. The Khamar Daban area is within reach of the watershed of Lake Baikal, which is known, unfortunately, to have been a dumping ground for industrial waste. If toxins made their way into streams and rivers, like the Snezhnaya, that the group drank from, they might have been poisoned. Certain chemical pollutants or algal toxins could cause acute reactions. However, typically, environmental water poisoning might cause gastrointestinal issues or long-term illness, not such immediate convulsions. Also, Valentina drank likely the same water and lived, unless maybe they all drank from a stagnant pool heavily dosed in something, while Valia didn't as much. Arguments for water poisoning. There was indeed mention that Lake Baikal is known to be a toxic waste dumping ground, and if waste was washed downstream, they might have drunk toxins that standard toxicology didn't catch. This hints at industrial chemicals, like heavy metals or organophosphates, that in low doses might be hard to detect after death. If a pocket of chemical waste got concentrated in a stream they used, it's possible. Mushroom or plant poisoning. The hikers foraged for wild food occasionally. Korovina was known to teach foraging skills. One theory is that they accidentally cooked poisonous mushrooms for breakfast that day. perhaps a toxin like muscarine or ibotenic acid from amanita mushrooms, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, excessive salivation, foaming, etc., in large doses. Amanita phalloides, death cap, can cause violent illness and death, though usually more drawn out, liver failure over days. Some others can cause neurotoxic effects more immediately. If the group picked mushrooms thinking they were edible, like mistaking a deadly amanita for a puffball or button mushroom, they could all have been poisoned at breakfast. Valentina did mention breakfast before breaking camp. However, she didn't recall anything amiss with the food. Also, mushroom poisoning usually has a latency. People fall ill some hours after ingestion, not almost immediately while hiking down. Arguments for mushroom/food poisoning. It explains simultaneous onset if they all ate the same toxic food. Symptoms like clutching throat, vomiting, delirium can occur with certain poisons. Muscarinic syndrome from some mushrooms can cause drooling, tearing, convulsions. Some rare toxins could cause bleeding, internal hemorrhage. Korovina, being a forager, could ironically have led to a mistake with a look-alike poisonous species. Arguments against Valentina survived without specific treatment. If it were a truly deadly poison like certain mushrooms, it's unlikely she'd be perfectly fine after. The time frame. They ate in the morning, then soon after people collapsed. Many mushroom toxins take longer, 6 to 24 hours for severe ones like death cap. Some faster-acting ones, like certain hallucinogenic species or strychnine-like effects, could act within an hour or two. It's not impossible, but not strongly supported. No mention of severe abdominal pain or diarrhea, which often accompany ingestion poisoning. The focus was on neurological and bleeding symptoms. Other poisons. Could it have been something like a deliberate or accidental chemical exposure? For example, nerve agents, which we will cover next, or some kind of gas. But those are usually considered separately. Waterborne toxins might be cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, if they drank from a stagnant pond. Some algal blooms produce neurotoxins, but in running mountain streams that's less likely. And again, Valentina drank too. In summary, while food water poisoning cannot be entirely ruled out, it lacks direct evidence. It remains a viable theory only if one can identify a specific toxin that fits the profile. The mushroom theory has been cited in some discussions because of the group's knowledge of foraging, but is generally not seen as the leading explanation by investigators. 8.5 chemical or military nerve agent. One of the most sensational theories is that the hikers were killed by a military-grade nerve agent or chemical weapon, either as victims of an accidental encounter or an illicit test. Siberia has a history of secret military installations, and the early 1990s was a tumultuous time with possibly lax control over old Soviet stockpiles. The symptoms described, convulsions, frothing, pinpoint bleeding, are indeed consistent with some powerful nerve agents. Nerve agents, like VX or the Soviet-developed Novichok family, cause overstimulation of nerves, leading to seizures, excessive secretions, saliva, tears, hence foam, loss of bodily control, and often death by asphyxiation or cardiac arrest. The bruising of lungs could be due to respiratory failure from nerve gas. Notably, Novichok agents were reportedly tested in areas near Khamar Daban during the late Soviet period. Arguments for nerve agent theory. The cluster of symptoms matches nerve gas exposure quite well. Convulsions, foaming at mouth, excessive salivation, possibly involuntary voiding, not mentioned but common, rapid collapse. Also, nerve agents can cause pupil constriction, which might appear as eyes bleeding if capillaries burst. Actually, nerve agents typically cause tearing, not bleeding, but a panicked witness might misinterpret tears mixed with blood from burst vessels. The rapid onset hitting multiple people almost at once is characteristic of breathing in or getting dosed by a chemical cloud. If they stumbled into an area contaminated with nerve agent, say a residual patch from prior testing, stirred up by the storm, those at the back, like Sasha, could be affected first if the cloud blew from behind, then others as it enveloped them. Valentina surviving could be because she was slightly removed or upwind, or got a lesser dose, maybe Dennis shielding her for a time. The heart attack in Korovina could be explained by nerve agent exposure. They often cause heart or lung failure. Historically, there were indeed chemical weapons programs in the USSR, and after its collapse in 1991, not everything was accounted for immediately. Buryatia's Dyatlov Pass moniker invites Cold War-style theories. The KP rumor about secret weapon tests suggests locals found it plausible they might have been unintended victims of something secret. Modern analog. In 2017 to 2018, Novichok nerve agents were used in assassinations, e.g., in Salisbury, UK. A reminder these substances exist and are deadly in tiny amounts. If a small amount can kill an adult, an open-air test or accident could definitely kill a group. Khamar Daban's relative remoteness would be a possible site for clandestine experiments. Arguments against nerve agent theory. No other casualties. If a nerve agent had been present in the area, might it not have affected the other hiking groups or wildlife? We don't have reports of dead animals around them, though scavengers later might have been fine if poison dissipated. Also, the kayakers who came on August 9th didn't report any issues, but likely the agent would have degraded by then, especially with heavy rain. Lack of official detection. One would think the autopsy might notice telltale signs of organophosphate poisoning, like certain enzyme inhibition, if they looked. But it's possible they didn't test for that specifically in 1993, given lack of suspicion. Or if a cover-up, results could be hidden. It leans on a conspiracy. Either the military was actively testing something and cleaned it up, or it was an abandoned agent from past. Both are conceivable, but unproven. The region was touristy in summer. A test there would be quite risky, unless it was an extremely localized secret facility. Bleeding from eyes. As noted in Wikipedia, bleeding from the eyes is not a recognized symptom of nerve agents. However, heavy tearing might look like bloody tears if capillaries burst. Nerve agents cause a lot of fluid outflow, tears, drool, mucus, which could mix with blood from nose due to pressure. Some propose a variant, not a man-made nerve agent, but a natural neurotoxin like from plants or insects. For example, could they have encountered aerosolized toxins, maybe from burning a certain poisonous plant in their fire? Or a cloud of volcanic gas? No volcanoes right there, though seismic activity can release gas. But nerve agent covers those bases more directly. The nerve agent theory remains one of the most popular in discussions due to the drama of it and the symptom match. Explorers Web calls it not outlandish, given the area's history. If true, it paints the hikers as tragic collateral damage of either leftover war chemicals or a state secret. It's the kind of theory that may never be confirmed unless some whistleblower or archive in Russia reveals tests in that area in 1993. 8.6 Other theories and factors. There are other ideas that have been floated, though less widely. Lightning strike or electrical phenomenon. Could they have been hit by a bolt of lightning or a ground current from a near strike? Lightning can cause bizarre injuries, nervous system damage, and even foaming from pulmonary edema in survivors. If a single lightning bolt hit near them, it might knock several people down. However, it likely would have left burn marks or other signs. No mention of that in autopsy, and Valentina didn't describe a flash or thunder at that moment. Though storm was there, lightning could have happened. Also, lightning usually kills 1 or 2, not 6, separately over minutes. Mass hysteria, panic attack, psychological contagion could cause a group to panic irrationally. Like one freaks out, then others do too. But panic alone doesn't cause foaming at the mouth or death. It might cause people to run or do dangerous things, like jump off a cliff potentially. But here, they collapsed physiologically. Animal attack followed by infection or shock. There's no evidence of an animal attack, no wounds. Some have asked if perhaps they ate or were bitten by something like a venomous snake or insect swarm. Khamar Daban isn't known for lethal snakes, and certainly not ones that cause such quick systemic effects on multiple people. Spiders or insects, similarly unlikely. If they foraged berries, could it have been toxic berries? Usually not so instantaneous either. Supernatural or paranormal. While not scientific, any unsolved mystery attracts theories of aliens or cryptids. Some might whimsically wonder if a yeti or a chuchuna, yeti-like creature, scared them to death, or if aliens experimented on them. These are not taken seriously in any investigative sense and have no evidence, so in a serious documentary tone, we mention them only as cultural footnotes. In fact, locals call Dyatlov Pass the place of the nine, with paranormal lore, and Khamar Daban might have spawned local myths too. But again, no tangible support for such claims. Given all these theories, many investigators believe a combination of factors is most likely. For instance, maybe there was a small avalanche or ground collapse that injured some and released underground gases, or a storm with infrasound panicked them and also a lightning strike hit, or they were exhausted and mildly hypothermic, then inhaled some toxic fumes like ozone from lightning or leaked rocket fuel from a crash, etc. One additional modern perspective. In 2019 to 2020, the Dyatlov Pass case was re-examined by Russian authorities, and they concluded an unusual slab avalanche plus katabatic wind likely caused those deaths, despite skepticism. That's the official line. By analogy, one might ask if some natural disaster specific to Khamar Daban happened. Avalanche or landslide. A small landslide could explain trauma, but there was no mention of injuries like broken bones, and they weren't buried or thrown. They were found in the open. Cold air burst, katabatic wind, is possible. A rush of freezing dense air might have instantly overwhelmed them, causing near-instant hypothermia and shock, and maybe lung barotrauma. Katabatic winds can indeed cause rapid temperature drops and hurricane-force gusts. If they experienced an extreme version, maybe their lungs froze, leading to edema and froth. Still, bleeding from ears is tough to place. In analyzing all, Explorers Webb's conclusion was essentially hedged. It's likely the group either suffered a nerve agent attack or an extreme weather event, perhaps involving infrasound. Due to the chaos and disorientation from the cold and from seeing her friends die, Valentina probably confused many details. We can't know what really happened. This underscores that even experts end up with an unsatisfying uncertainty. Let us turn now to some broader context and comparisons, which might illuminate Khamar Daban further. Sometimes, Looking at similar incidents can help us understand what might be unique or common in these tragedies. Episode 9. Parallels and Precedents. Other Unsolved Expedition Mysteries. The Khamar Daban incident has often been likened to the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, and for good reason. Both involve experienced trekking groups meeting bizarre ends in the wilds of Russia, with survivors, in Dyatlov's case, one who turned back early, in Khamar's, one who lived through it, and a plethora of theories. In fact, the Russian media explicitly called Khamar Daban Buryatia's Dyatlov Pass. Let's compare these two and mention a couple of other lesser-known cases of mysterious group deaths. Khamar Daban versus Dyatlov Pass. Dyatlov Pass, 1959. 9 young hikers led by Igor Dyatlov died in the northern Ural Mountains under strange circumstances. Their tent was found torn from the inside. The group had fled in socks or barefoot into minus 30 degrees Celsius snowy night. Over weeks, their bodies were found in various locations. Some seemingly froze to death, but others had inexplicable internal injuries, rib fractures, skull fracture, without external trauma, and one woman had her tongue and eyes missing. Some clothes had traces of radioactivity. The official Soviet investigation blamed an unknown compelling force. Over 60-plus years, theories range from avalanche, military tests, parachute mines, infrasound panic, as discussed, to wild ideas like Yeti or aliens. In 2019, a Russian reinvestigation favored an unusual avalanche plus hypothermia explanation, though not all are convinced. Similarities. Both incidents involve a group of fit, trained young people, led by a capable leader, caught in a lethal scenario they couldn't overcome. Both happened in winter-like conditions, Dyatlov in deep winter February, Khamar in unseasonable snow in August. Mysterious behaviors. Dyatlov group cut open their tent from inside and ran out inadequately dressed. Khamar group exhibited violent, inexplicable actions like running away, tearing at their throats or bashing heads. In both, some ended partially undressed. Paradoxical undressing in hypothermia might explain that in both. Rapid death. In Dyatlov, it's believed most died within hours of fleeing the tent, though some lasted weeks sheltered in a ravine before succumbing. In Khamar, all but one died within minutes. The unclear cause led to proliferation of theories, including military secret weapons. Dyatlov has theories of a Soviet radio frequency weapon or rocket stage causing injuries and panic. Khamar has nerve agent or secret test. Locals in both cases have lore. For Dyatlov, indigenous Mansi legends, Mountain of the Dead, feed mystique. For Khamar, the term Buryat Dyatlov Pass keeps that frame alive. In both, the survivor did not, or in Dyatlov's case, could not, shed full light. Yuri Yudin, who left Dyatlov's group early due to illness, only knew they were well prepared and could only speculate later what went wrong. Valentina survived but was traumatized and potentially an unreliable narrator on some details, leaving room for doubt. Differences. The Dyatlov group had no eyewitness to the fatal event. We reconstruct from physical evidence. Khamar has Valentina's direct account, which is incredibly valuable. Injuries differ. Dyatlov had severe physical trauma in some, rib fractures consistent with pressure or an explosion shockwave, etc. Whereas Khamar's victims mostly had no external injuries other than what they inflicted on themselves. Their trauma was more internal, physiological, foam, bleeding. Environment. Dyatlov was deep winter in high mountains, avalanche prone. Khamar was summer in a forested mountain area. The contexts bring different likely causes, e.g., avalanche very plausible for Dyatlov, less so for Khamar in summer. Aftermath. Dyatlov's case, during Cold War, was hushed and files hidden for decades, spawning massive speculation. Khamar Daban in the 90s was reported but then somewhat forgotten outside circles, overshadowed perhaps by Dyatlov. Only recently has it gained more international attention via articles and Reddit/YouTube discussions. Number of survivors. Dyatlov's had none present at incident, one left earlier. Khamar had one through the ordeal, which is why we know more about the actual moment-to-moment. Comparative theories. Dyatlov's modern official stance, small avalanche causing panic and then hypothermia, shares a theme with Khamar's official stance, storm causing hypothermia. In both, skeptics point to weird details not explained by those simple answers. For Dyatlov, unanswered points were like radioactivity on clothes, orange skin, missing organs, likely animal scavenging. For Khamar, it's bleeding ears, simultaneity. Both cases draw the interest of scientists. For Dyatlov, even a 2021 study modeled a slab avalanche with Disney Frozen movie snow simulation technology, showing the enduring fascination. For Khamar, perhaps similar rigorous study is needed. Could someone simulate the storm's effect on their bodies? The Chivray Pass tragedy, 1973. Another lesser-known incident often called the other Dyatlov is the Chivray Pass incident of 1973. 10 ski hikers from a Kuibyshev, Samara Aviation Institute died in the Chivray Pass in the Kola Peninsula, far northwest Russia, in late January 1973. They were found frozen, some unclothed, some in a pile, others spaced apart. The official cause was hypothermia. It was midwinter and they faced a blizzard. But, like Dyatlov, questions arose. Why did they split up? Why did experienced skiers not make a proper camp? There were reports they had dropped their packs and ran, some half-dressed, reminiscent of Dyatlov and Khamar behaviors. No violent injuries were noted, so it seems a case of sudden severe weather and perhaps mass panic or exhaustion. Some theories for Chivray mention possible fighter jet sonic booms or a rare weather phenomenon that scared them, causing them to abandon camp. One detail: some of the Chivray group were found tightly huddled, suggesting they tried to keep warm together, but others were far away, as if they ran off irrationally. This inconsistency echoes Dyatlov and Khamar, where some ran, some stayed. Chivray shares with Khamar Daban the fact that the official investigation concluded hypothermia and closed the case quickly, despite lingering puzzles. It's not as famous because perhaps it could be chalked up to simply a catastrophic storm, but those who delve into it note the similar unexplained madness that seems to have overtaken the group. The Kola Peninsula in winter can have fierce winds, maybe infrasound here too, or even aurora-related electromagnetic effects, speculative. The Shataiva Group, Lenin Peak 1974. Though not an unsolved mystery, the story of Elvira Shataiva's all-women mountaineering team in 1974 is a haunting expedition tragedy to compare. Shataiva led 8 female climbers to summit Lenin Peak, 7,134 meters, in Pamir, Central Asia, in August 1974. They successfully summited, but on descent, they were trapped by a severe blizzard at high altitude. Over the next 2 days, one by one, they died of exposure and altitude complications, despite radio contact with base camp. Their last radio transmissions indicated their dire condition: vomiting, illness, then silence. Rescuers were nearby but couldn't reach them in time due to weather. All died on the mountain. The cause was clear. Nature's fury combined with altitude, not a weird unknown force. However, it showed even expert climbers, Shateva was one of USSR's best, can be overcome by a sudden weather event. The key difference? Their behavior was not irrational or mysterious. It was a tragic but straightforward death from a storm at 7,000 plus meters. Shateva's incident is often cited to demonstrate that even very prepared groups can perish if conditions turn against them. For Khamar Daban, some might say similarly, a perfect storm of cold and maybe lack of preparation, though they were prepared. But Shateva's lacks the bizarre symptoms. Other cases and patterns. Russia's vast wilderness has seen other lesser-known tragedies. For instance, in 1961, a group of 9 died in the Altai Mountains when caught by an avalanche, sometimes mentioned alongside Dyatlov. In 1991, a caving team in Kovu Aksi, Tuva, suffocated due to toxic gases in a cave. Not hiking, but shows natural CO2 pockets can kill. Could Khamar have had a sudden outgas of CO2 from soil, possibly from permafrost vents? Unlikely, but worth noting, natural gas pockets exist. The Klochkov group disappearance, mentioned in Wikipedia's See Also, refers to a group of tourists led by Alexander Klochkov that vanished in Siberia in 1975, their bodies never found. Without bodies, rumors of Yeti or UFO arose, but likely they fell into a crevasse or got lost. What stands out in these comparisons is that Khamar Daban's incident is among the few with a living witness who saw the deaths unfold. This gives it a layer of horror. Hearing Valentina describe it is far more visceral than forensic clues. It also means any solution must align with her testimony, whereas with Dyatlov or Chivrué, one can theorize more freely because no one saw it directly. We see a recurring theme. Groups of hikers/climbers in extreme conditions sometimes exhibit erratic behavior and perish in ways that are not immediately obvious. Hypothermia, as mundane as it sounds, is often the silent killer behind many of these tragedies, sometimes cloaked in weird symptoms or actions. Yet, Khamar Daban's case continues to nag investigators because of the sheer violence and rapidity of the event. As of the mid-2020s, interest in cold case mysteries like these is high. Scientists, for example, used computer modeling to give plausible answers for Dyatlov Pass, avalanche. Perhaps similar modern techniques, meteorological modeling, toxin analysis with new tech, could be applied to Khamar Daban. Some Russian articles in the 2020s, like the Tech Insider piece from 2024, indicate experts are still debating the cause, which keeps the case in the public discourse. Now, nearly 33 years since that tragic August day, what have we learned and what remains unknown? Let's conclude with the current status and lingering questions of the Khamar Daban incident. Episode 10. Legacy of an Unsolved Mystery. Unanswered Questions and Modern Reflections. Decades later, the Khamar Daban incident of 1993 remains unsolved in any satisfying way. Officially, it might be closed, but ask any hiker, rescuer, or researcher familiar with the case, and they will acknowledge the gaps in understanding. The story has transformed into a cautionary legend among outdoor enthusiasts in Russia, a stark reminder that the wilderness can still surprise and confound us, even in the age of satellite phones and GPS. Unresolved questions. Several pressing questions keep this case open in the minds of many. What was the immediate trigger? Was it purely the weather? Or was there a discrete event, a toxic cloud, an acoustic phenomenon, a lightning strike, that set off the fatal chain reaction? No definitive evidence of any singular trigger has surfaced. Why only that group? Other groups were in the area, including the leader's daughter's group. They encountered the same storm. Why did Korovina's group alone fall victim in this extreme way? Did they wander into a uniquely hazardous micro-location? Could something they did, like eating a certain plant or setting up camp at exactly the wrong spot, have made the difference? The condition of the bodies. Can modern forensic science reinterpret the autopsy findings? For instance, could advanced toxicology now detect compounds in preserved tissue samples, if any exist, that were missed in 1993? It's unknown if any samples were saved. The partial remains and damage by scavengers also limit us. Valentina's memory. Could hypnosis or further psychological evaluation help clarify her memories of the incident? Possibly not ethical or reliable, but curious minds wonder if we've truly gotten her full story, or if trauma withheld some key detail even from herself. Authorities' role. Some suspect that, similar to Dyatlov, there may have been a quiet directive to not investigate too deeply, especially if a state secret was involved. The fact that Komsomolskaya Pravda in 2018 couldn't even find the alleged 1993 article blaming Korovina suggests records are spotty. If it was something like a military accident, its plausible evidence was scrubbed and the case hushed with a convenient hypothermia label. However, unlike Soviet times, 1993 Russia was relatively open and chaotic. A cover-up would require intent and coordination that might not have been present amid that chaos. Will we ever know? This overarching question lingers. In Dyatlov's case, despite enormous study, we still debate. Khamar Daban might similarly remain a mystery unless someone comes forward or new data emerges. Modern updates. In recent years, the incident has seen renewed attention. The 2018 interview with Valentina Utachenko was a major update, finally hearing from the survivor after 25 years. It humanized the story and confirmed many of the legendary aspects. Also, around the 25th anniversary, 2018, and 30th anniversary, 2023, various media revisited the case. Komsomolskaya Pravda's series, 2018. It brought forth voices of those who knew the victims, challenged the blame placed on Korovina, and documented Valentina's account. Valentina firmly denied Korovina's culpability and pointed to pulmonary edema as cause, putting to rest any notion in her mind that her mentor erred gravely. Online articles, 2019 to 2024. Outlets like Russia Beyond, RBTH, in 2019. Morbid Curiosity, 2022. Medium, 2021. And Tech Insider, 2024, have summarized the case for new audiences. Tech Insider's piece in 2024 is notable for compiling expert opinions and even clarifying that the route was Category 3, approximately 213 kilometers, and describing the Mongolian cyclone cause. This indicates an effort to fact-check and contextualize the tale rather than just sensationalize it. Community interest. The case became a topic on Reddit, YouTube, and podcasts in the English-speaking world around the 2020s as part of the wave of interest in unexplained mysteries. Such attention sometimes brings new theories or attempts at research. A Reddit post in 2020 asked why 6 died, but others survived in the area, stimulating discussion on altitude and poisons. Expert reviews. Many in the rescue and hiking community have offered their opinions. Yuri Golius, lead rescuer, blamed Korovina's methods and hypothesized the group was simply pushed beyond their limits physically. Even if this view was contentious, it underscores the importance of leadership decisions in extreme situations. Vladimir Zinov, rescuer, pushed the altitude sickness angle, influencing Valentina herself to accept that. Vladimir Borzenkov, tourist and researcher, suggested infrasound, which he wrote about on Dyatlov as well. This shows crossover between mystery cases. Those intrigued by one often study the other, sharing ideas. Medical professionals, if any weighed in publicly, generally lean toward a natural explanation, like combined hypothermia, edema. The scenario of nerve agent, while titillating, would require someone with knowledge of chemical weapons to seriously confirm or debunk. It's worth noting that after the Dyatlov Pass official reinvestigation concluded avalanche in 2020, some voices called for a reinvestigation of Khamar Daban, 1993. Given the passage of time, an official inquiry is unlikely unless significant new evidence appears. However, perhaps an academic study could be done. For example, researchers could model the weather that day. Meteorological records from August 1993 exist, and see if winds could produce infrasound frequencies in that topography, or analyze if any industrial accidents occurred upstream that could have released toxins. Documentary tone final thoughts. The Khamar Daban incident stands as a sobering tale. In a calm, reflective tone, what does it teach us? It reminds us that even ordinary adventures carry risks that can compound in unimaginable ways. A series of small decisions or events, camping in an exposed spot, a freak storm, perhaps an unlucky physiological reaction, can cascade into catastrophe. It highlights the heroism and heartbreak of survival. Valentina's ordeal, wandering alone for days, is a testament to human endurance, but also a tragic portrait of a young woman forced to bear a trauma that few can comprehend. For the families of the victims, closure has been elusive. They only know their loved ones went into the mountains and never returned, and the answers died on that slope. Petropavlovsk residents will never forget the sight of 6 coffins lined up in mourning. The Azimut Club's dissolution reflects how shattering the event was to that community's spirit. Possible interpretations: where we stand. A modern assessment by someone trying to reconcile all evidence might posit the following scenario as one of the more plausible. The group, having been drenched and chilled, was in early hypothermia on the morning of August 5th. In that weakened state, perhaps one member, Sasha, suffered an acute medical crisis, maybe a form of altitude-related pulmonary edema, or even a stress-induced aneurysm, causing him to bleed and convulse, which set off panic. In the chaos, others' conditions, hypothermia, or altitude issues, suddenly worsened. Some experienced a kind of hysterical reaction, Tatiana, Vika, Timur, possibly exacerbated by limited oxygen, or even a whiff of something like ozone from the storm. The strong wind could have emitted an infrasonic rumble that amplified the sense of doom and physical discomfort, further disorienting them. The combination of physical and psychological stressors led each to collapse, some from pulmonary edema, foaming blood, some from cardiac arrest, Korovina, others from plain hypothermia, almost simultaneously. Valentina, slightly separated and perhaps constitutionally tougher, manages to avoid the final spiral and escapes. This narrative, while speculative, tries to weave bits of each theory into a cohesive chain. It's not provable, but it shows how multiple factors could align. The calm aftermath. In wrapping up a documentary narrative, one might end with the image of the Khamar Daban range itself. Today, hikers still trek those mountains. They likely pause at the site, if known, where a memorial plaque or an obelisk might stand. Often, Russian hiking tragedies are marked by memorials. Dyatlov Pass has one. Chivre has an obelisk. Perhaps on Khamar Daban, there is a small memorial bearing the names of Lyudmila Korovina and her 6 students. If not, their story is etched in the annals of adventure lore. In the end, the 1993 Khamar Daban incident remains a haunting mystery of the wild. It is a story of adventure and tragedy, of a leader's devotion and a survivor's resilience. The mountains keep their secrets, and this case is one of them. As investigators and storytellers, we piece together what we can. A timeline of hopes dashed by a sudden horror, a collection of theories reaching for truth, and the solemn memory of 6 vibrant lives lost. In the silence of those mountains, one can almost imagine the echoes of that fateful day. The wind howling, a distant scream, then quiet. We may never fully know what dark echo passed through the Khamar Daban that morning, but by recounting the incident in such detail, we honor the victims and perhaps learn a measure of humility before the enduring power of nature's mysteries.